A very good evening and welcome to another of our business and marketing related webinars from WineGB. And as ever, we've got a great session lined up for you tonight. Don't forget that we have Q&A options for you, so do go onto the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and post any questions throughout the course of the next sort of 45-50 minutes or so. I'll be monitoring those, so I'll be passing on any questions to our speakers. And also, don't forget, there's also a chat room. I know that both Madeline and Sue on the screen here can't see you, so if you feel like just popping on the chat room and saying hello and introducing yourselves, that's lovely because they can see that. So let's move on to this evening's session. It's the world of PR and communications that we're going to be covering tonight. In a world buzzing with up-to-date news and information and across so many different channels, how can you get your voice heard and your story noticed? Our speakers will offer expert insights from operatives of the world of PR and communications. We're really lucky to have two great experts in the room tonight who can approach this topic from multiple angles. They're both PR professionals who know how journalists tick and with added experience that can provide so much more insight, invaluable to everybody. So together they'll provide you with some key hints to effective communication of your brand and story and the perspective of your audience as well, to help you understand what they're looking for and how you can most effectively get your message across. So I'm not going to spend too long introducing, but I just ought to say their names. We've got Madeline Waters, who's an expert in wine communications. And we also have Sue Llewellyn. Welcome back, Sue. Some of you who've been on earlier webinars will remember Sue from her really excellent presentations on social media. But Sue has the added benefit of seeing things from both sides of the coin, having worked in PR but moved across to journalism. So I think we'll have some very interesting insights from her too. I'm going to be asking a few questions as well, but first I'm going to ask both Madeline and Sue to introduce themselves, tell you a little bit more about themselves and their background, and then we'll move on to sharing a few slides, which I think will be the basis of a lot of really interesting discussion. But Madeline, if I can ask you to introduce yourself a little bit.
Thanks, Julia. So yes, I run a small boutique PR company called Coco. I've worked in the PR industry for just over 25 years now, and always specialised in food and drink because I figured, well, you know, stick with something that you absolutely love, and there's, you know, it's much easier to talk about products that you believe in and that you're passionate about. I've worked with lots of generics. I ran the Napa Valley Vintners UK office for 10 years, and then I started the first ever campaign for Wines of Lebanon in 2010, which ran for 5 years. And Julia and I met quite a few times at Provine, didn't we, staying in the same hotel. And then I've also worked with Sarah Abbott, who's a master of wine. We work with Wines of Georgia, the Consorzio of Soave, Prosecco Superiore, and we've done some work with Wines of Japan and Wines of Turkey. So lots of different wine regions. And I think what I really like are the small emerging regions that have got stories to tell, and there's something a bit different. I've also worked with several brands, and I also currently work with a Lebanese wine brand because the generic sadly is no longer. I've done lots of restaurant PR and food brands as well, so covering quite a bit, but staying focused in my sector, in my lane of food and drink.
Thanks very much, Madeline. And Sue, a little bit more about yourself.
Well, I started off in PR. I set up my own PR business, I think, when I was about 24, and I specialised in green, environmental, animal welfare, wildlife conservation type things. So I did that. I think I was also the communications director of the Born Free Foundation at the time. I did that for 8 years, and somebody came up to me and said, "Have you ever thought about going into television?" Which I thought was a terrible pickup line, but I thought, actually, why not? So I joined the BBC. I became a journalist, and I was then working on, well, I did World TV, the news channel, and quite a lot of time on breakfast, which was great because that was kind of a consumer affairs program. And for the last 5 years of that, I was working on the last part of the program, which is much more, you know, I don't know, kind of a softer side of stuff. So I was reporting, doing celebrity kind of interviews and things like that. So 15 years in the newsroom, I got so many emails from PRs. Every day there would be an inbox full of things, and I can tell you all the things we don't like, and I could suggest a few things that you should be doing. But 2008, I thought, right, now it's time for another change. And this social media thing looked quite interesting. So I left and I set myself up, once I'd figured out how it all worked, as a social media consultant, coach and trainer. And that's what I've been doing. So I work for people like the Wellcome Trust, the BBC. I introduced Twitter to the BBC Newsroom, Foreign Office, all sorts of different people, and lots of startups and small businesses, including, because it's my passion too, food and drink. And my other half works doing sort of helping startups with the food industry, kind of challenger brands and stuff get going. So I mentor quite a few of them. So I hope I can give you some helpful advice as to how to get your word, your message out there, and storytelling tips as well. I'm looking forward to this. It should be really interesting. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thanks very much, Sue. So I think everybody can be very confident that we've got some serious experience here and plenty of knowledge to share with you. Now, let's get to basics. What is PR? And I think this is the right time now to ask Madeline if you wouldn't mind sharing those slides. We've got some wonderful slides that cover those basics, some of the rules and the essentials. And Sue and Madeline are going to contribute to it as well. So I'll hand over to the both of you over these slides.
Thank you, Julia. So the first question really is what is PR? I think it's one of those industries that nobody really understands what it's all about, what it stands for. I mean, obviously the word stands for public relations, but some people think it stands for press release. It's about how you talk to your audiences, but it's not just about column inches. I think it's all about building your brand, your reputation, and how you speak to your audiences, whether that's your press audiences or your customers or your consumers, the sommeliers who pour your wines, and developing relationships with them is what really helps communicate your messages. And I think, one of the key things is really focusing on developing a network of people that really going to take your message to a wider audience. Do you have anything to add there, Sue?
I think they always say, most publicity, not all publicity, but most publicity is good publicity. And I think it is about getting your message out there. So there are multiple different channels you can do that on. And I think we'll probably go through quite a few of them. But I do find there's a tendency for people to think of PR really as just being traditional media, as being press in particular and broadcast media, as opposed to all the new media, and also the your own media, your blogs or your websites or programs, podcasts and things that you can do yourself. So there's a lot you can do yourself that is also PR, and word of mouth is the best PR you could possibly have. So there are many, many places, and it's all about relationships and getting your message out there. So I think we'll cover various aspects of that. And
I often find, I'm sure you probably found the same in an agency, that it's quite frustrating. Often PR is the last thing to be looked at and the first thing to be cut, when actually, there are a lot of very cost-effective things you can do to get your messages across, that you don't need to invest a huge amount of money, because as Sue just said, there's so many things you can do yourself.
It's an investment in time if you're doing it yourself, obviously, and time is something very few of us have, but I think there is a lot that you can do. And I think really it's important to have a clear strategy. And exactly that with the PR. I'd also add into that social media is often an add-on rather than an add-in. And these days it's essential to put it in part of your recipe for success.
Mm-hmm. And I think, yes, having some clear messaging and key messages that you keep, you stick to throughout all your communications, and just make sure you're speaking in the same tone of voice wherever you are, because that's your brand and that's what you should be about. So here, I'm sure a lot of you do this very well, and I just wanted to sort of go back to basics and see, looking at how you do it, where do you start? And first thing, you really got to think about who you're speaking to. Are you speaking to a trade audience? Are you speaking to somebody who's a specialist wine writer, or is it a local journalist? So you've got to really make sure you're targeting your information to the right person and providing the information that they need. That sounds basic, but some people that you don't even put contact information or the details of what you're trying to communicate. And I think one of the key things I learned sort of very early on when I first started out in PR. I was trained by an ex-journalist, and she drilled me in, you know, how to write a press release. It's the who, what, why, where, when. Why being very important, because you've got to be telling them why they should be interested, and keep it factual, and don't put your own opinions and lots of sort of superfluous adjectives in. I think, you know, Sue, you probably were on the receiving end of a lot of
I was on the receiving end of a lot of very overexcited non-news stories that were pitched to the wrong place. So there's a lot of people who are terribly excited about something that isn't actually a story. And I would always say, always, and everything you're doing, the who, what, why, when, where, how, all of that is the most important thing to answer first. And the who. The who is, who are you aiming at? Not just who you're pitching at, but who is the audience of that person? You know, so a breakfast TV audience is incredibly different from a Radio 4 audience, or you know, many of the other trade press, for example. So you've got to be super clear that your message is for the people watching, listening, or reading that publication, as well as the journalists. They won't be interested if it's not going to appeal to their audience. And that's the first thing. So people first, audiences first in everything you do. Otherwise, it's pointless. And don't get too overexcited about things that aren't really interesting. So overselling things, over flowery language. I know you have some lovely examples, Madeline, of the language you shouldn't use.
I mean, I think you do notice that certainly in sort of European markets where, you know, for example, in Champagne, some of the press materials that come out of there are very flowery and over descriptive, which, you know, it's a different style. It's a different, you know, in France or Italy, that kind of thing works. But, you know, we've had the same with Prosecco, Superiore, Consorzio. You know, they send us these press releases translated into English. And you think, gosh, I could never send anything like this out. And also some of the stories that they say, right, we've sent this to the Italian trade press, can you send it to the UK trade press? And there's nothing there, there's no news. And so, you know, no, there's no point sending it, because you've got to make sure that you've really got something to offer your target audience.
The other point with that is, if it's no news and you keep sending these things out, or the boss says send out a press release, they won't trust you the next time you come back. They'll just think, oh, this person is a pest and they never have any good stories. Whereas if you build that relationship with them, you offer them something that is news, it is interesting. I love it when a PR rings up and offers something. But if it's somebody just saying, did you get my press release? And it's really not relevant, then, oh no.
I think, yes, and that's to the first point about developing relationships, because, you know, it takes a long time. It's a long game. It's not a quick results business. But I think once you've developed those relationships, and you're right, so if people trust you and they know that you're going to provide them with newsworthy information, or they're going to provide you with all the facts that they need in one place, and it's doesn't take several different phone calls and emails to really get to the bottom of what it is you're saying, or how to attend the event, or whatever it is, then, you know, they will listen to you much more. You've got a much more open ear. And I think that's, you know, there is sometimes it seems like some people get much more press coverage than others, and, you know, that's probably because they're doing something right at that point as well, that they're getting the ear of the journalist much more frequently.
Did you want to pick up on the, I can see your next thing, the bullet points and how to actually present it to people?
You do that as the person on the receiving end.
The person on the receiving end, I think it comes as quite a surprise how many emails we would get every day with people trying to pitch stories. And so that you don't want all this, you know, nonsense thing. The headline is critical, that you attract people's attention with it. So the subject line needs to stand out and the headline has to be important. And we don't want pages and pages and pages of stuff. A few bullet points will be really helpful. If they want more information, they can ask for it, but don't overload. Never include attachments with your press releases. They just go into spam, or they won't get opened, and they're just not relevant. So don't do that. Just to, again, answer the questions of who, what, why, when, where, and make it relevant, make it interesting. And what's in it for the journalist? Fundamentally, they want to tell a good story. They want to look good. That's one thing. And they want their audience to be happy. Otherwise, they won't have a job. And they have no time. So you cannot be flowery and all that. You've got to come straight to the point with a story that is actually a story, that you've got to pass the who cares test. Otherwise, you know, nobody's going to take any notice of you or trust you.
No, exactly. And I think, I thought that was going to be my next point. But I think we've sort of covered everything about, you know, what you need to include to and what you don't need to include to excite a journalist.
Yeah, contact things. I can't tell you how many times there wasn't an out of hours contact number. I know we're all at home now, but
Yeah.
an out of hours contact number and something that actually works. It was terrible trying to get hold of people on a Sunday, for example. And news doesn't stop. If you're working on a TV news program, it doesn't stop.
Yes, I think that's a good point. If you're trying to pitch something, a news event to broadcast media, say your local media, and you've sent it out on Friday and the event's on Monday, you've got to be available to respond to them over the weekend. Again, it seems
the planning desk wouldn't have been planning, you have a rough idea of what's coming up, but it wouldn't be set in stone. That's up to the sort of day team if you're talking TV things or radio stuff. Mm-hmm. So they will come in, look at the rest of the news agenda and then decide what to cover. They might well have got something in the bag already, pre-recorded stuff, but I'm obviously talking broadcast here, but yeah. So do make sure that you're contactable out of hours.
I think, yes, most people do seem to be 24/7 these days, but it's I think, again, could seem obvious, but, do your research, find out what that journalist writes about, and, don't send, a press release to somebody who only writes a wine column that's focused on very specific, product mentions. They're not going to be interested in new machinery that you might have just bought. It does seem obvious, but I think it's one of the, I've been to a lot of talks with journalists or ex-journalists, and the first complaint is always like, people don't read my column, they don't know what I'm writing about, they haven't done their research. And I think that must be one of the most annoying things if somebody's pitching something to you that they don't even write about. So, look at the newspaper, the magazine, the website, and regularly, not just once, because, some issues can be different from others. And, I think when you're talking to the wine writers specifically, don't send samples unsolicited. A local journalist might be delighted to get to his desk and find a lovely bottle of English sparkling wine on it, but there's nothing more annoying to all the wine writers who have so many samples sent to them every day that they haven't asked for. And so you really need to develop the relationship first and offer the sample, and then see if you get a response. And another way, a really good way of doing research into what your sort of target journalist is interested in is look at what they're talking about on social media. You can really stalk people there, can't you? So
absolutely, you can find out so much, and I would recommend that you do that. So you can switch on notifications on Twitter for journalists that you think you want to target, and just monitor for a while, or put them on a Twitter list. Look at what they're talking about. And absolutely look to see whether they've already covered a particular topic before you try and pitch to them. You get an idea of the sort of things that they're interested in and the sort of person they are as well. So, and many of them these days will have DMs open, so you can send a direct message. You don't have to do the public, please can you follow me so I can DM you. And a lot of them like being pitched to on Twitter. Obviously not publicly, but you can send them a direct message. And they're infesting Twitter, they're everywhere. So if you're just doing that, you'll find a huge amount of information out about them. But I think looking at who they write for, or what the program is, who the audience is, getting some information like that is enormously important, because you will immediately be ignored if it isn't relevant to their audience. So do your research. And it's tons of people haven't done that. They're just doing this blanket thing. Also, don't promise things to one journalist, or a bunch of them. We like exclusivity sometimes. We like to build relationships. So this sort of idea that you're just one of many is not helpful, because everybody wants that slight edge on a story. So pitch things accordingly, and also look and see what's going on in the news. I'm amazed that more people don't ring up when there's been something topical. So I know for all of you winemakers, for example, if it's a frost, if the weather has been atrocious or it's been very wet or something, you could comment on that, what it's going to be like for harvest. You could add something that would make a business story really interesting. Or if it's something, again, about people going to visit the places, these days they're looking for that different human angle to stories. So if you can ring up a news desk and say, I'm available and I could comment on this, this, and this, that adds that extra colour, that human element, they'll love you. They'll absolutely love you.
And then I guess you'll become the go-to person when there's a frost, as you say, or some weather event, and that's all about developing that relationship.
And if I could also say, which is probably but I'm going to say it anyway, Women, please. Lots more women should be on volunteering. And if you need any help, I'm more than happy to help coach you, because the number of people I would ring up to come on a program and talk about something because they're an expert. And the men would always say yes unless they were on holiday. And the women would say, oh, I'm not an expert, or I've got childcare or something like that. So please, women, stand up and be counted, because they're actively trying to get more of a gender balance, and people of colour. So there's a real active trying to find new faces to talk about things. So that is an opportunity for you to stand up and be counted. I could go on forever. The next, yeah. Oh yeah, what's news?
Yes. Well, I think yes. I mean, again, there's lots of different types of content. There's news stories, but it has to be genuinely news. For example, you know, the Wine TV Awards have just been announced, so that's a great opportunity to go to your local paper and go, hey, we won an award, and you know that's news. But do it while it's fresh news. Or for a local business story, we've created new jobs, sales are increasing, that kind of thing. Vintage reports, and also as Sue said before, the sort of things about the weather, and you know, something suddenly has happened, then and be there to comment on it. Then other things you could be looking for, like product reviews, as we've talked about with the wine writers in the weekend papers, for example. You want to get featured in their Wines of the Week columns, because you know they are powerful and it does help sell through products through the retailers. And then there's the sort of the bigger area of features, which I don't think we've really got time to sort of cover in detail there, but I think that's much harder, as I've said, for individual brands to sort of approach that area. And then, oh, sorry, I keep pressing I don't know if I have to do it on the screen, but Sue mentioned this earlier, and this is really important, I think, is, you know, does it pass the so what test? Why is it interesting to put out this press release? You know, you've got to really make sure it kind of, you've gone through it and looked at it, all the different angles. Is like, why would a journalist be interested to read this? You know, you might have spent a fortune on some new equipment for your winery that you know, it's the best thing you've done in 10 years. And then you send a press release to the local press saying, oh, we've just spent £20,000 on this new machinery. That's not very interesting to them, but you can turn it around and spin it into, you know, an investment story or a growing business. And, you know, then there are ways to couch it that does make it interesting. And often there are plenty of stories that you're sitting on and you don't even realize it. I think, you know, I think you would probably agree with that, Sue, wouldn't you? But
absolutely. Just maybe bring people in who don't necessarily know the business and see what they find interesting about it. Or, you know, run things past people and see whether it does pass the so what test. It's not also, if you're talking about social media, it's not just the who cares, but who's going to share. So you need to be making the story shareable, and that's by touching people's emotions. And it could be something triumphant, like, you know, you've had a fantastic time, you've employed people who've had a great time. You know, think about the human side to the story, particularly for your social media, and how you can generate some kind of, whether it, you know, success makes people feel good, and we all need that at the moment. And it's not going to be shareable if it's boring. That's for sure. So if you've got something that's good, or it's funny, or it's just engaging, you know, new ways of looking at things. Weird, wacky and wonderful always works really well on social media. Obviously not too wacky. But finding those sort of, oh, I never knew that type of stories, or explainers. That's another fantastic thing you can do on social media. Make short little videos about how to do things, or what something means. Animated little videos like that are really shareable, and it's a great way of getting PR for your brand. And also the journalists will be all over that too and think, oh, that would be good for my program or my publication. I must find this person out, go and talk to them. So creating your own content. I have so many people who used to come up to me over the years and say, how do I get on television? I want to be a presenter. And I'd say, start your own YouTube channel, film yourself, do something, get out there. And all of you can do that on Instagram in particular. I think that's a fantastic platform for you. Or thought leadership pieces maybe on LinkedIn, commenting on the wine industry, being seen as an expert in your area. All of that kind of stuff, the journalists will find you and go, oh, that person knows what they're talking about. I want to speak to them. So a lot of it is being proactive, I think.
And one thing we haven't touched on as well is imagery. I mean, obviously that's really important for social media, but equally important to send something to the press with lovely photography that's easily accessible, that's not covered in branding. That's one way of really ticking a box and being helpful to the journalists as well as providing the package. So you've given them the photography, you've given them the information, the time, the date, the contact, and making sure that it's not overly branded, and it's beautiful, high quality photography, high enough resolution for them to print if it's print. And
actually, don't worry about thinking you necessarily need to hire a photographer for that. No. Says she, having just got herself a new phone. These BBC use this a lot for filming. So filming entire reports. So filming, editing, doing clips, you don't necessarily need huge amounts of equipment. You can actually just do it yourself. So you can make amazing, can't believe how beautiful my photos are now with my phone. It's fantastic. But you can do all of the filming and editing yourself, and there's loads of tips and advice for how to do that. So don't be scared and think you need to hire photographers all the time. You can make incredibly good resolution, good quality videos. But I would just pick up on that branding thing. Certainly if you're ever doing, like for example, BBC, you would not be allowed to go around plugging your brand. So don't go around wearing clothes because they might expect you to change. And don't go, well, we at, Wine Inc. or something say this, and at Wine Inc. we do this, and they will hate that, and they won't invite you back if you're not trustworthy. So one mention is fine, but that's about it really if you're doing a public service broadcaster.
That's a very good point. And I think obviously this is your area of expertise, but it's not just about the press who can disseminate your information. There is, again on here, there's thousands of people that can talk to your audiences for you. I mean, I'll leave this one to you. So if you want to talk about how you use social media.
Yeah, it's finding your fans and your super fans. People who like your products are your best PR because they're going to, so you need to build those communities and relationships with them because they're going to sing your praises. If they like your wine, they are going to tell their friends about it. And if you then so for example, if they've done a picture having a lovely dinner with some lovely wine, you can share that in your stories and tag them so they know that you've been mentioning them.
Thank them, yeah.
Yeah. Sorry?
And sort of thank them as well. So you can start developing a relationship.
Yes, it's a two-way process. So, and the more they see that and you do that, everybody's happy. And so it's a really, really good way of doing it. And don't be fooled by big numbers. It's not just the people who've got 60 million followers. That you won't get anywhere near them unless you've got a vast budget, and then it's not authentic. What you should be doing is the smaller influencers, the micro influencers, people who just have good engagement on their accounts, not necessarily vast numbers of followers. So people like that would be, really great fans and build those relationships. Be proactive with your social media, like their stuff, comment, invite questions, ask what they think, do, polls and question and answers on the Instagram stories, do IGTVs and talk to people, find other partners that you can talk to, complementary, whether it's food partners that you can do an IGTV, Instagram TV live, and tell people something useful. And honestly, it is really not that difficult, and it's quite fun, and people will enjoy it. Obviously, this is for the consumer, and the journalist will also see it. But you can do a lot of your own publicity and be your own PR, but by building those sort of relationships with your fans and your super fans, the advocates who are going to go around and talk about your products. And just by listening again on social media, you'll see people tagging or mentioning your brand, drinking it. So find out who your customers are, make sure that you're building relationships with them, and that's how the word will get out even more. And everyone knows somebody, everybody does. And they may well know somebody really, really, really big in the media who then decides they're going to write a story because you're a nice person. So yeah, I think social media is certainly Instagram is a platform you should definitely be looking at if you aren't already. And Twitter, if you want to lurk and stalk the journalists, because they're all there. I can see some questions on the Q&A, but I haven't opened it yet. So forgive me for just looking away and seeing.
That's the last slide. So I think we can stop sharing the screen and then maybe come to the questions. So, again, pretty obvious, but you'd be amazed at how some people want to try and fudge things, and it's never advisable because you'll get found out.
Oh yeah, always tell, yes, definitely, don't be like him. Don't ever be like him. Yeah, that's really a really seriously good point there. Don't try and make something up if it's not new, or pretend it's, you know, a new angle on something. No, don't do that. Honestly, if you lose trust, you lose everything. So that's really important. Questions?
Thank you, both of you. That's been fantastic. They're such good basics, and they're very fundamental. I think a lot of people, when you mention the word PR and writing press releases and talking about yourself, there's quite often a confidence issue, I guess, as well, but also actually knowing which routes to take. And I wanted to pick up on something, because obviously social media has become a really powerful communications tool. Perhaps sometimes at the cost of traditional PR and getting into sort of both broadcast and printed media. And I just wondered whether there was anything you could add about really this relationship between social media and, you know, leading social community, or work, you know, your relationship with the community on social media, but taking it further, taking it out to print and broadcast and things. And how does the relationship work? Because, you know, it's quite bewildering, really. You've got some wonderful stories that you're building up on social, but can you actually transmit that or translate that sort of smoothly across into perhaps a really good PR story that might result in national coverage? I guess the flip side of that, and this is something that we experience quite a lot at WineGB, is, you know, you'll get there'll be quite a nice article about English wines generally. We want to articulate that back on social media to our social followers. So it's how we kind of keep that relationship sort of tight, if you like.
I think that comes with planning and having a strategy, really. So, and also very much an advocate of create one big piece of content, and then you split it up and figure out how you can make that into multiple pieces for social media, or where you can place a story. So, you know, what's the angle if it was the trade press, or what's the angle if it's the, you know, the consumer something or other, you know, radio, local radio, or whatever. So thinking about the different angles of each of the pieces of news you have, I think is going to spread it further afield. And being really clear on social media, you know, people talk and people like stuff, and you just don't know where things are going to go to. So I think I'm always telling people to get themselves a strategy if you haven't got one, whether, you know, a comms strategy with social media properly built in, a social media strategy, a strategy for each of the different platforms, because they're very different, and have a really, really clear plan on what you want to get out of this. Who are you aiming at? And to answer all the who, what, why, when, where, I think sometimes, I can't remember, it's one of those lean business things, but there's like 5 whys. Each time you think of something, it's why this, but why that? Dig down and you will find other stories that might be worth writing something about or doing something for. Have a look at what other people are doing. And the other thing is not just your competitors in the wine industry, but others that you feel inspired by, or an angle on a story. I think it's really good to look outside our bubbles. We are sitting there in the same kind of thing, hearing the same thing from the same people all the time. So I deliberately go out and look to see how other people are doing things and finding what you can learn. And it might be that there's a brand that you just think, oh, wow, they've done something amazing here with their storytelling. And honestly, you can use stories on Instagram to tell amazing stories. So upping your skills as a storyteller. And a storyteller needs a hero, it needs a journey, you know, it needs a good narrative. So thinking about that, and, you know, you all have brand stories, founder stories, you've probably got some lovely nostalgia in there somewhere, you know, how things used to be, or what we used to drink, you know, back when we first started drinking, in my case, quite a long time ago. So there's a lot of history as well, and that is very shareable on social media. If you're thinking about trends, that's really good for news. We always want to look forward, you know, and what's going to happen in the business next, or, you know, what we can expect from something. So I'm relentlessly curious about everything. So just keep asking why, how, you know, who, what, why, when, where, all of those things. And I think you're going to come up with more story ideas than you thought you had, and more places that you can place them.
And I think it's a good platform as well to be noticed by journalists. You know, they pick up a story from something you've put out on social media, and, you know, it all links together in that way.
And actually, it's also not just stories that you put out on social media. It's you as people behind the brand. Then they feel as though they know you, they trust you, they like you. And they're more likely, if you're using social media socially, not as a broadcast tool, if you're using it socially and proactively, they're much more likely to think, hey, this person's a really good speaker. So put yourself on video and they can invite you on the program. Just talk about something that sounds engaging and human that their audience is going to relate to. That's really important. And then they think, this person is great, I'll have them on.
Is the response on social media more positive to that through sort of more traditional broadcast? Because I'm sure some people might have experienced that when you send out a press release or you get a journalist inquiry, it's always trying to find the bad news element of it. They react to bad news. How can we turn it around to being reactive to positive news?
I think you need to be more celebratory, that telling those stories of having overcome something works brilliantly on social. But actually the media isn't all bad. And I think these days, the problem we have now is that there's just so much bad news around. Squeezing onto the news agenda in a time of a pandemic is extremely difficult. And this is one of the questions, I think, was how do some people get coverage and some don't? And it is largely due to what's on the news agenda that day. And I'm talking obviously about reactive news rather than, a magazine that's 3 months hence or something like that. And I have many stories that I spend ages filming and shooting and going out and reporting with somebody, and then the Pope died or Prince Charles got engaged and my stories were dropped, and it was terrible, letting all those people down. So when you're against, the huge news agenda, and so that's why it's really important to keep an eye on what's going on there. And if there is a story that you can add to, that is an opportunity for you. It's definitely an opportunity to get your thing out there. And they're always looking for case studies to illustrate a broader point that's in the news, whether it's job losses, job creation, I don't know, environmental things, that's really hot. But just get on video as well. Stick stuff up on YouTube of how to do things. It's all awareness.
And I guess you can lead people, if you're sending a press release out, you can lead people to your presence on social media anyway, so they can at a quick click, they can actually see a little bit more about who you are and what you do. Madeline, an interesting question has come up actually. Stories could be interesting for journalists, but what about the consumers? And I think it comes back to the sort of construct of your message to send out.
Yeah.
We always talk about the audience. The journalist is going to be the mouthpiece to the consumer, and how one sort of covers that. Are there any kind of rules that one has to sort of bear in mind when you're pushing your message forward through PR?
I think it's, again, going back to sort of researching what the audience of that publication or website or whatever it is, reading it yourself, looking at because the journalist isn't going to keep writing stories that doesn't interest his or her audience, because obviously then they'd be sacked. But so obviously what they keep producing is what their audience is looking for. So read that regularly, have a look at the wine column or the feature page that you're trying to get onto, and see what they write about, so that then you can work out what it is their audience is interested in, I think, and the angles and the type of information they're looking for.
I'd also add that journalists are consumers too. We're not all monsters, and we do like wine, so that they are consumers too. But it's the human side of it. Yeah. I think we have a tendency to think that news has to be really, really serious, or and I totally disagree now. I think it's much more human. We want to see the people behind the brands. We want to hear what it's like working in an environment. We want to hear about people's struggles and how they've overcome things. We want that kind of whole storytelling and journey. The whole brand story makes for great PR. It really does. And I think this is where it's different from, certainly when I was in the newsroom, it was much more formal, the kind of whole PR process and the storytelling process of business. And now it's much more, we have such broad issues that if you can bring it back to a person who illustrates that area clearly, to make it understandable for the audience, that's fantastic. So it's really just, building up your confidence to get out there and do it, she says. I know that's not difficult. It's not that difficult. If I can do it, you guys can do it, honestly.
I think one thing that you've also touched upon is obviously a blanket approach doesn't always work. One size does not fit all. When you're pushed for time, how can I put it? You've got a lovely story. You want to get it right out there. how much time really should you spend in trying to work out which channels and which publications and how many iterations do you have to factor in to make it into a successful PR campaign? You know, you've got a great story, you want to go regional, you want to go national, you want to go to specialist or whatever. Do you have to write multiple versions of the same press release to get the kind of coverage that you would hope?
I personally would say, because a whole campaign PR thing, I'll leave that to Madeline.
Yes, I was going to move on to that one.
Yeah, the whole campaign part of it. But I think this is part, again, back to the sort of strategy thing. Who are you aiming at? And where are they? Which platforms or papers or programs or whatever are they listening to, watching? That's the most important thing when you're building your strategy. What do you want to get out of this? What are your business objectives? So I think one of the questions in there, Janine was saying, how do you build a strategy? I would start by saying, you know, why are you doing this? What do you want to get from this? Who are you aiming at? What do you hope to achieve by doing it? And then where are the people you're aiming at? What things are they reading or looking at? You build your audience personas and you think this is what they need, and needs are really important. What they need to hear from me, not what I want to tell them. And I think that's the most important part of it. We're so used to that whole broadcast. I'm a journalist, I'm writing and I'm telling you this. That doesn't work anymore. It's what does the audience need? Because they're not going to sit and buy the paper or listen to the program anymore. They can get news anywhere they want. They don't have to do what they were doing in the old days. So that's why if you meet their needs, and we all have the same needs, you know, we want to be informed, entertained. We want to be given perspective. We want to be inspired. All of these things as humans, if you can do that in your stories. So if you do have a fantastic story, as you're just saying, Julia, if you've got a really good story, think, okay, I could have this angle on it for this publication, or this for this type of person, or this for this social media platform. You can just spin it in different ways. I don't mean spin in the old-fashioned bad way. I just mean you can find a different angle. And they're quite often, this is what the BBC do actually, they hone their story based on the need the audience has. So our default position as journalists is update me, tell me what's happened, but it could be give me perspective, or it could be educate me. So tell me about the British, you know, the English wine industry as a whole. So that's the sort of educate, or the perspective piece of how important is this, I don't know, new weevil or something, rather giving me, I don't know why I said a weevil, but give me perspective on something. Entertain me. There must be funny stuff that happens. Inspire me, show me how I can do the pairing with the foods, or what, you know, how to create that lovely thing to make us all belong. That's the other thing, we want to belong. So thinking of how you can meet the needs of your audience, you can take a good story and spin it in lots of different directions. And as for the campaign,
well, that's great. Yes, a good question that has come up actually. PR is something else, isn't it? Madeline, I'm looking firmly at you. And it does sort of come back to basics. What is PR? We've obviously been really focusing, because this was the sort of nub of tonight's webinar about the communication side, but PR actually does encompass a whole load of other things. And there are components there that would
be. I mean, it sort of can be as big as you want it to be, really, because you could say, oh, I'll do it myself, or I'll hire someone specifically just for their contacts with the wine writers. Say you've got a product, you've got some stockists, and now you need to make sure people are writing about it, so it gets some reviews, so you get some traction. And I mean, I think that's pretty important in the wine sector. It's all very well getting it on a wine list or getting it in a retailer, but it's got to be pulled off the shelf, otherwise they're going to take it off the list. So, you know, you might hire someone specifically for that little discrete part, or, you know, big brands might have a big PR company that encompasses everything from events, sponsorship. You know, there is a sort of grey area whether a PR agency would handle social media. Often they do, or often there's a specialist agency. You know, this is talking about sort of big brands with big budgets, and, you know, a separate advertising agency. But, you know, PR isn't just about getting the column inches. It's about finding the right way to tell your story and communicate your message to all different audiences. You know, I mean, personally, what I do is I obviously specialize in wine, but I don't just speak to journalists. I have a big database of trade contacts, because I also know that that's a really good way of communicating your message. You know, a sommelier is the gatekeeper to the customer in the restaurant, so they need to understand what you're about. So developing those relationships as well, you know, that's still PR.
Yeah, and that's why you need a PR with the contacts and with the experience, I think. So you can do a lot yourself, but I think having that network and that established relationships with people, you know, PRs know who's interested in what. It'll save you a lot of time.
Yeah, I mean, it's about time, because it's not rocket science. It's just about, you know, you've got to step up, you've got the contacts, and you know, most of you probably have got your day jobs to be getting on with. It's, you know, it's more about time. You know, doesn't mean you can't do it yourself, because I think everyone can.
Yeah. Also, you'd be able to tell them if it's a story or not. Like, that's not interesting to anybody, or yeah, that's brilliant. So also to find those sort of, you know, little nuggets that perhaps you had taken for granted, you know, a PR or a journalist would be able to spot them and say that would make a really good campaign or a good story. Yeah. So what other questions have we got?
I think we've covered, there are quite a few that have been covered in how you've been responding, which is absolutely fantastic. I'm just having another little look here. Just with your BBC hat on, I see Patricia's actually asked a question: is the mention of BBC still wrong for WineGB or one of our regions? I guess this comes back to sort of how much you articulate the brand, or
it's a subtle thing. When you go on a program, you're given a name check when you start, and if you're on TV, you get what we call an Aston, or the BBC it's called an Aston. It's your name and your job or your title or where you work, and that kind of is considered to be slightly enough, rather than. And I know that lots of media trainers would say to you, you know, we at Wine Inc. think this, and it's so forced and so unnatural. You wouldn't speak like that if you're having a normal conversation with somebody. So don't try and force a brand name into something where it doesn't really fit. So I don't think it's wrong at all. It's just it's like a seasoning, isn't it? A light seasoning of your corporate brand is fine, but an over plugging of it is really going to ruin the dish.
Yes.
So, keep talking about food all the time.
I wanted to ask a bit about the timing, because so we've got our fantastic story. We're really enthusiastic. We've written a good factual content, and we want to pitch it to the newsrooms. Maybe aiming really high, go to the national newspapers, maybe regional papers, that sort of thing. Are there still any rules around when to actually pitch your press release? We now work obviously we operate in a 24/7 world. So is there somebody always there looking at press releases, or are there still some high times and perhaps times to avoid when you want to send a press release through?
That's a really good question. It entirely depends on the publication or the program. I know that that's again why you need to do your research. So if it's a TV program or a radio program, you know when they're on air. That's a bad time to ring them up or try and talk to them. You know exactly when the program starts and when it ends. Don't try doing it then, because they've got plenty of other things to be thinking about. Otherwise, I would always ask, is this a convenient time? And if not, can you just tell me how your day goes and what would work best, so that nobody bothers you at the wrong time in future? You know, that it's common sense really and politeness, but is this a good time to talk? If not, you know,
most of them will tell you.
Yeah. And don't ring them up 5 minutes after you sent an email and say, did you get my email? That doesn't work. I didn't like that very much either. But yeah, I think just ask people.
There are advantages in still picking up the phone and speaking to them. I think we so rely on slapping it all on an email or posting it sort of over the airwaves. Do people still value that direct telephone contact?
Incredibly interesting point, because I was at a conference back in the old days. I was at a conference when we were allowed to, and it was a panel about future skills that journalists need. And one of the things that came up at the start of this was they need to learn how to use the phone. So somebody said, I wish they'd bloody well answer the phone in the newsroom, because the younger ones don't. No. It's really weird. They would far rather.
Yeah.
Right?
They don't like the phone at all.
No, they don't. So if you're ringing, that's one thing to bear in mind. The email approach is more familiar to the younger journalists. Us oldies would probably like to have a nice chat with somebody if they were offering us a good story. But that's why it's the relationship building part. You know, you find out how they like to be pitched to. But I think, that's really something to bear in mind, though. They don't like answering the phone, the young ones. Very weird.
And, they don't necessarily like the intrusion, just to pick up the phone and unexpected. I think you've got to be really mindful of that, and because they are mostly inundated.
Oh, that's interesting. I suppose actually one of the more modern approaches is DM, as you mentioned before, Sue. If you realise that people don't recognise, don't particularly feel comfortable answering the phone, then try and contact them.
But that's a great way of, if you don't know the person's contact details, if there's no way you can find out from the website their personal email address, that's a great way. They can always ignore it. It's not offensive.
No, it's perfectly acceptable to say, please can you follow me so I can DM you, because you can't, unless their DMs are open, you can't send them a private message. All journalists know that's perfectly fine, and they can unfollow you afterwards. But if you look at their bios, a lot of them in the bios say DMs open, or they have an email in their bio. So check that first, and then you don't need to do the please can you follow me. Just send them a message. But bear in mind, it's jumping into somebody's DMs is a little bit like, personally, I think it's a bit like shoving your foot in the front door, because it is a private space, and yet they invite it. And as long as you're not wasting their time and you have a good story, they'll probably love it.
I guess one other question, and this comes back to do your research, of course, but if you want to contact local, regional, national press, obviously you've got the generic news desk contact details. Is it always worth doing a little bit of research into finding a specific person, or are they so inundated because people have done the specifics? How does it work between a sort of generic news desk sort of holding email, presumably, and going direct to people? Is there any kind of advantage in doing either or both, or what's the best way?
I think the person, in my experience, the news desk generic email is the black hole. You don't.
That's a black hole.
And if you find you've done your research, and say you're looking to pitch a story to a national newspaper, and you look at that newspaper every day to see what that person is writing about, buy it or look at it online every day for a week, and then you can see the type of stories, and then you can always deduce their email. If it's not there, you can work out the formula and pitch it directly to that person. Oh, I saw you wrote about frost last week, and I want to talk to you about how we're overcoming it. That kind, you can bring in something personal. That's what my personal approach would be. I don't know if you'd shoot me down as a journalist.
No, I would say absolutely do that. The other thing is to go into Twitter, and if you put in, I don't know, Manchester Evening News or whatever the name of the publication is you're trying to find, put that in inverted commas so you get the whole word, and then click on people. Anybody who works for the Manchester Evening News will probably have that in their bio. So then you'll find people who work there, and all journalists will have that. So that's one way of finding them. And then you can see if they've got DMs open. So putting in the publication name and then clicking people in Twitter will reveal a whole pile of journalists for you. Or if it's a magazine, look in the front of the magazine. It's always got the features editor.
And I think that, for how I work is more about the personal approach, and I've never been a fan of the blanket press release, because it's just, you're just throwing it out. You might as well throw it out the window to hundreds of different, it doesn't necessarily work. And I think nurturing the contacts, and back to your point, Julia, when you asked about if you haven't got very much time, or how much time should you allow, I always think, as Sue said before, offering an exclusive. So just pick one publication that you really think this would be my top A-list to get into, offer it to them. If they don't like it, then have work down your list. So because they do like to feel that they've got a scoop, or they've got a story that no one else has got, or it's like sometimes you'll see the wine writers reviewing everybody, like Kylie's wine, for example. Everybody was talking about Kylie's wine, but it might be nice to say, if you're targeting the Daily Telegraph, right, go to Victoria Moore first with your new release before you send it to the others. Those kind of things I think work, because that is all about developing the relationship.
Yeah. And I'd also say, if you see something they've written in the past, and you speak to them, or you send them a message to say, I saw your piece on such and such, and I thought you might find this interesting, or picking up on your piece, because then they know that you've seen it. They know, you've done your homework. So that's really good. Another thing that might be worth looking at from time to time is looking at hashtag journo request. Journo request, there's an awful lot of weird things they're asking for, but occasionally it might be wine or small businesses, or something. But just keeping across that, I know lots of PRs keep across that, but it's quite a handy place for finding journalists who are looking for slightly obscure.
And that's on Twitter, or is that across all the channels?
It's actually also on LinkedIn, but not. people use it on LinkedIn, but
it's more immediate on Twitter, isn't it? And it's where they're looking for the case study to illustrate X, Y, Z, for example. You know,
okay, so that's hashtag journo request. I've just had a quick query saying how do you spell that? So that's JOURNO request. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
One interesting question that you may have seen that's come up in the Q&A: how long will a good story last? That's a really interesting one, because I know sometimes a good story can breed another story, and it gets, you know, one wonderful example is, you know, there was hearsay that a certain brand of English wine was served at the wedding of the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, and when did they get married? Quite a long time ago, and it's still referred to. Is there, this is perhaps a bit mercenary, but is there any way you can kind of feed that a little bit, you know, to sort of stoke the interest in a story that you might have? Are there some clever ways that you might be able to keep a story going, maybe for longer than just tomorrow's paper?
The keeping it going that's slightly dodgy, you know, involving the royals and trying
You
to
want to be quite careful.
yeah, I'd be very careful with that.
It depends on the type, doesn't it, as well? If it's very, you know, if it's time sensitive.
Yeah. So generally things don't last that long, but what you can do is you can revisit and update stories. So if there's something that you've had in the past and you can do, you know, this is the investment that we made in our winery, you know, 2 years ago or something, this is where we've come since, or this is what we've learned. So you can revisit things, and that's quite good, because people like to follow up on something. So, or, you know, a story can last, bad stories can last for quite a few days.
Yeah.
But good stories, they tend to just move on. So unless you've got a different angle on it, to keep it going. But I would revisit stories, update them on what's happened since something happened. And people like that.
And don't waste all the hard work you've done before with that original story, you know, bring it back in. You put a lot of effort into it.
Exactly.
A new sustainability initiative or something, yes, as follow up in a year to say, oh, we've saved this much carbon, or, you know, we've used this much less glass, or whatever. And I think people do like that, and stats and things like that.
And document everything that you're doing as well, photo wise and video wise, so that you've got some stuff that you can show them. So say you've just planted a vineyard, and, you know, 5 years later you go back and show them what it looks like now. So keep visual material. I think that's really important as well. It's sort of a record of everything, but go back and revisit stories, because generally speaking, the news cycle is really quite fast. So a bad story can last for a long time. And actually, that's the other point, is if there's a bad story, you must show up on for the media. You cannot hide, because that's how bad stuff spreads. So it's incredibly important you have a crisis strategy, and you are ready in case anything happens. And particularly if it breaks on social media, you need to be listening to it and respond to it, even if it's a holding statement to say, we're aware of this, we're looking into it. Otherwise, the news just, you know, spirals out of control.
That's actually an incredibly important point. And I know we're approaching the end of the hour, because inevitably on social media, conversation escalates and escalates and escalates. And, you know, it feeds more and more. And it's presumably, it's how you find the right balance between reacting but not being defensive. And because if you react too defensively, then actually that can sometimes kick back on you, can't it?
I would suggest that what you should have for that is a series of tweets or responses that are written as a mild rebuke or correction, and then getting slightly stronger if you need them. But the rule number one of crisis PR is to take it out of social media, to make sure that you've given them a response. You know, I'm sorry you feel that way. Here's a number that you can call and, you know, let's speak about this. Here's my email, or something like that. You've been seen to respond. There's an answer given. You're not saying, you know, la, 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 I'm not talking to you, because that's where things get out of control. So to be seen to respond. So you can just imagine, I mean, something you should do anyway, is imagine what's the worst thing that can happen. Somebody gets poisoned by your wine, or there's a huge batch of something really dodgy, and the botulism everywhere. I mean, just imagine. I love doing this. I love disaster scenarios. I used to love it when everything went wrong when we were live on TV. It was great, because you have to think really fast. So think, what is the worst thing that could happen, and how you would respond to it, and be prepared.
And this presumably also comes back to nurturing the relationships with journalists, Madeline. You know, actually you pick up the phone and you contact them, if it's going to be all over the newspapers.
Yes, I think that would be, you know, I guess obviously it very much depends what it is, but I think being proactive in that situation is much better than sort of hiding away and just reacting to what people are asking you. I think if you go out there with the facts and stick to the facts and tell the truth, you know, people make mistakes, things go wrong, people accept that. I mean, obviously, unless it's something terrible and fatal, but you know, you saw how, I can't remember which theme park it was, and they had an absolutely
Alton Towers.
Yeah, and you know, I thought they handled that exceptionally
Brilliant.
well. They fronted up and dealt with it.
Yeah, that's a really good case study for how to handle it. So the first rule is, if something bad has happened, empathy is the first thing you need to express. You know, our thoughts are with, you know, that's incredibly important that you do that to start with, because otherwise you look heartless and then everyone's against you. So, but that was a really good example of that, and you know, standing up and being counted. And if you've made a mistake, own up and apologise, on social media particularly.
Well, I think we've covered so much this evening. I'm sure we could carry on and have a whole other session about things. I think, in summary, tell the truth, deal with the facts, no fluffiness, no floofiness, use your personality, and listen to the recording again, and then you'll pick up all those other very magnificent tips that both of you have come up with. Thank you both so much. Sue, lovely to see you again, and thanks very much indeed for sharing your experience and your insight, and from both sides of the coin, as it were. And Madeline, very many thanks. Your expertise in the world of wine has certainly shared an awful lot of you know, useful insight into how to handle our wonderful wine press influencers as well. So thank you to everybody who've participated. Thank you for all the questions as well. This is being recorded. We'll have the recording up on YouTube and then also linked off our website in the next few days. It just leaves me to say again, thank you very much, Sue and Madeline, and to all of you, and a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.